My husband was buried under fresh snow, and before I even left the cemetery, his phone lit up with a message he never should have been able to send. The snow had been coming down since before the sun came up. It was that thick, quiet kind that softens everything: footsteps, voices, even grief. I stood at the edge of the grave in Greenwood Memorial Park just outside Richmond, Virginia, watching the white flakes settle gently on the dark wood of my husband's casket. 42 years. That's how long Richard and I had been together. 42 years of Monday morning tea, silly arguments over the thermostat, and reaching for each other in the dark. And now there was only snow, silence, and the heavy reality of a future I never imagined facing on my own. My daughter-in-law, Piper, stood next to me, her arm linked through mine. My son, Miles, stood on my other side, his jaw tight, his eyes dry in that way men are taught to keep them. Our grandsons, 8-year-old twins, pressed close to their mother. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could feel it. Something big and permanent had changed in their world. Richard's sister, Eleanor, had flown in from Los Angeles. She stood across the grave, dabbing her eyes with a folded handkerchief, just like she used to when we were younger, back when we all believed loss was something that only happened to other families. The minister spoke the words he was meant to say. I heard them, but only faintly, like rain hitting a window from the outside. When the service ended and people slowly began walking back to their cars, I felt something buzz in my coat pocket. Out of habit, I reached in, expecting my own phone, but what I pulled out felt different. Smaller. Older. I looked down and froze. It was Richard's phone. I must have slipped it into my pocket that morning without thinking, just wanting to keep a piece of him close a little longer before handing it over to our family lawyer, Grant Westfield, like Richard had requested in his estate instructions. The screen was lit. There was a new message. For a second, I almost put it away. I almost ignored it. But grief does strange things to you. It makes you desperate for any sign that the person you lost is still somehow there, still reaching back across whatever distance death creates. So I opened it. The message was from a number I didn't recognize. No name, just words. Don't read this here. Go to the car. Come alone. I stood there, completely still, as the snow kept falling around me. People murmured their goodbyes, exchanging hugs and promises to stay in touch. Miles gently touched my arm. Mom, the car's ready whenever you are. I nodded and told him I just needed a couple more minutes. He gave me that careful look he'd been giving me for the past 2 days, the one that said he was watching me closely. Then he walked off toward the parking lot with Piper and the boys. I turned and made my way to our old Mercedes. Richard had driven it until about 3 years ago when his legs started giving him trouble. I slid into the passenger seat, the same place I'd always sat, and looked down at the phone again. Another message had come through. Richard left something for you. Not at the house. Check the storage locker. Unit 15. The key is taped inside the back cover of his field guide, the red one. On the second shelf. I read it once. Then again, and then a third time. My breath fogged up the window. Outside, the last of the mourners were leaving the cemetery. I thought about Richard's field guide, his worn copy of the Sibley Guide to Birds of Eastern North America. He took that book on every hike we ever went on. It sat on the second shelf in his study, exactly where the message said. I knew that shelf. I knew that book. I had dusted around it 1,000 times, but I had never heard anything about a storage locker. In all our 42 years together, Richard had never once mentioned anything like that. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Miles offered to stay with me, but I told him I needed a rest and that I'd call if I needed anything. He lingered in the kitchen doorway, the way he always did when he thought I wasn't telling him everything. Then Piper gently guided him out, giving him a look that said to give me space. I loved her for that. As soon as they left, I went straight to Richard's study. The red field guide was right where it always was. I picked it up carefully like it was something fragile, something still carrying a part of him. I turned it over, and there it was. A small silver key, taped inside the back cover with a strip of blue tape that had hardened with time. I sat down in Richard's chair and held the key in both hands. He had planned this. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. Richard had arranged it with the same careful thought he gave everything in his life. He had been a civil engineer for 34 years. He built bridges. He understood better than anyone that what holds something together, or lets it fall apart, comes down to the strength of the foundation. And somehow he had built something here. Something he meant for me to find. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold hours ago, turning the small key over and over in my hands. My thoughts kept drifting back to Richard's last 6 months. He'd seemed distant, but I had blamed it on his illness. He spent long stretches in his study with the door shut, which wasn't like him. Twice I had walked in without knocking and caught him quickly shuffling papers away. At the time, I thought he was just tired. Now it felt like something else entirely. I kept asking myself the same question. What had he been hiding, and who was he hiding it from? By 8 the next morning, I was already on the road. Richmond Self-Storage sat off a service road near Broad Street. It was a low, plain concrete building, surrounded by a chain-link fence that looked even more depressing under the dull, gray February sky. I found Unit 15 at the end of the second row. My hands felt steady, even though I didn't feel steady at all. The key slid into the lock and turned. When I pulled the door up, the noise echoed sharply in the quiet morning air. The unit was small, maybe 7 feet deep and 11 feet wide. Most of it was empty, but in the center, covered by a tarp weighed down at the corners with old paint cans, were 3 banker's boxes and a laptop I didn't recognize. On top of the first box, written in Richard's neat, precise block letters, was a label for Margot. Everything you need is here. Seeing my name in his handwriting nearly took the breath out of me. I lowered myself onto the cold concrete floor, not caring that my coat was getting dirty, and opened the first box. Inside were files, dozens of them. They were organized by date and color-coded with the kind of careful system that used to drive me crazy and now made my chest ache. There were printed emails, photographs taken with what looked like a telephoto lens, and page after page of detailed notes. This wasn't the work of a sick man passing time. This was focused, intentional. It looked like the work of someone who had been quietly angry for a long time. Right on top was a handwritten letter. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Margot, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get there in time. I'm sorry. Everything in these boxes is the truth, organized in a way I know you'll understand. Start with the green files, then the yellow. Don't trust anyone in Richmond until you've spoken to the name I wrote at the back of this letter. Our boy didn't do what they said. I can prove it. I just ran out of time to do it myself. I love you. I always have. Don't let them bury this the way they buried me. Richard. I read it 5 times. By the 6th, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. Our boy. He meant Miles. 2 years ago, Miles had been accused of financial misconduct at Chesapeake Realty Partners, where he had worked for 9 years as a senior project manager. The accusations came out of nowhere. Falsified procurement records, inflated contractor invoices, and payments routed to some numbered company that auditors claimed was tied to him. He was fired in a way that made sure everyone in Richmond knew about it. His reputation didn't just take a hit, it was shattered. The RCMP investigated, but never filed charges. Still, in a city like ours, that didn't matter much. People didn't need a conviction to make up their minds. They judged you at work, at social events, even while sitting next to you at your grandkids' school programs. For 2 years, Miles had been trying to rebuild his life. He found a job at a smaller firm. He never spoke about Chesapeake Realty or what had happened there. He became quieter, more careful, like someone who had learned the hard way that everything could fall apart without warning. Richard believed him from the very beginning. So did I, but belief alone isn't proof. It's just love speaking. And love hadn't been enough to clear our son's name. So Richard went looking for something stronger. I stayed in that storage unit for 4 hours. The green files were the first place I started, just like Richard had told me. And what I found inside changed everything. Over the past 2 years, Richard had been quietly investigating Chesapeake Realty Partners. Step by step, just like he did everything else, he had tracked their financial structure. What he uncovered wasn't random, it was a pattern, and it was too consistent to be an accident. The company's CEO, Franklin Dalton, had been using a rotating set of shell companies to siphon money out of development projects that were partly funded by municipal grants. The so-called irregularities tied to Miles? According to Richard's findings, those had been created after the fact. Transactions had been altered and backdated in the company's system. Paperwork had been manufactured to make it look like there was a trail leading to a numbered company. One Miles had never even heard of, let alone controlled. Richard had even found an original version of one of the key documents, a contractor invoice, buried in the physical records of a subcontracting firm Chesapeake Realty had cut ties with over a year before the accusation surfaced. That original document matched Miles's records perfectly. But the version Chesapeake Realty gave to their auditors? It had been changed. Someone had set my son up. And whoever did it had been careful enough to believe they'd never be caught. At the back of Richard's letter, just like he promised, there was a name. Tracy Chen. Investigative journalist, Washington citizen. She's been looking into Franklin Dalton for 3 years. She's trustworthy. She'll know what to do with this. I sat there for a long time, just staring at her name. Then I carefully packed everything back into the boxes, handling them like they could break, and carried them out to the trunk of the Mercedes. Once they were loaded, I drove home. I didn't tell Miles. Not yet. Richard had been very clear, read everything first, understand it completely, and only then take action. Miles didn't know about the storage unit. He had no idea his father had spent the last years of his life quietly doing what the legal system never managed to do out in the open. Telling him now before I had a plan felt dangerous, like putting a live wire straight into his hands. So I waited. For 3 days, I did nothing but read. I took notes in a brand new notebook with a red pen, just like Richard had taught me years ago when I used to help him review his engineering reports. I cross-checked everything. I looked up the numbered companies in the clerk's information system. I verified dates. I matched the names of city council members mentioned in his emails with public records. And the more I read, the clearer it all became. Richard had been right about everything. The evidence was detailed, organized, and hard to argue with. Franklin Dalton and at least 3 other senior people at Chesapeake Realty had built a false story on purpose. They needed someone believable to take the fall. Someone senior enough that the accusations would stick, but not powerful enough to fight back. They chose my son. He was good at his job. Too good. They were afraid he might eventually see what they were doing. On the morning of the 9th day, I finally picked up the phone and called the number Richard had written down. Tracy Chen answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm and measured, like someone used to holding back her reactions until she understood the situation. I told her who I was. I told her my husband had passed away and that he had left behind documents meant for her. Then I explained as simply as I could what those documents were about. There was a short silence. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, "I've been working on a story about Chesapeake Realty for 36 months. Can I ask, how much documentation did your husband leave?" 3 full banker's boxes, I said. Organized by date and cross-referenced. He was an engineer. Another pause. This one longer. "I think we should meet," she said. Not over the phone. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Washington. I told her I would drive up the next morning. What I didn't tell her was that I had already made up my mind before I even called. If this evidence was as solid as I believed, I wasn't going to let it sit forgotten in someone's desk. Richard had built something. I was going to make sure it stood. The drive to Washington took just under 3 hours. I left before Miles and Piper were awake. On the kitchen table, I left a note saying I was going to visit one of Richard's old colleagues to return some borrowed books. It was the first time in 40 years I had knowingly lied to my son, and I felt it the whole drive, sitting heavy in my chest. Tracy Chen looked younger in person than she did in her byline photo. Mid-30s, light hair pulled back, with a small scar just above her right eyebrow. She was already seated at a corner table when I walked in, a cup of coffee in front of her and a notebook open beside it, pen ready in her hand. She looked like someone prepared to get to work. I set the first banker's box down on the table between us. She glanced at it, then back at me. My husband spent 2 years putting this together, I said. He believed our son was framed by Franklin Dalton to protect Chesapeake Realty's access to municipal development grants. He documented original contractor invoices before they were altered, traced the shell companies, and identified what he believed were payments to at least one city official. Tracy opened the box. She lifted the first green file slowly, like she already knew it might change everything about her day. Then she started reading. I sipped my coffee and watched her face. 45 minutes passed before she finally looked up. Or her expression had changed. The neutral, professional calm was gone. In its place was something focused. Still. One of the officials named in these files, she said quietly, is the same person my source stopped talking about 7 months ago. The week after he went silent, he bought a lakefront property near Lake Anna, paid in cash through a numbered company. I've been trying to trace that money for 3 years. She tapped the file in front of her. This connects it. I nodded. At some point during that conversation, I realized my hands had stopped shaking. I didn't even know when it had happened. What I need to know, Tracy said, is whether you understand what happens if we go forward with this. They'll know the story is coming before it runs. They'll try to tear your husband apart, and through him, they'll come after you. They'll dig into your son, your finances, your history. It's going to be hard. My husband died 2 weeks ago, I told her. My son has spent the last 2 years watching people treat him like a criminal. Hard is a word I've gotten used to. She held my gaze for a long moment, then gave a small nod. I'll need to independently verify some of this before we publish, she said. 3 to 4 weeks, maybe longer. Can you keep this quiet until then? I lived with a secret this big for years without even knowing it, I said. I think I can handle 4 weeks. That was the first time she smiled. I drove home with the boxes still in the trunk and a different kind of weight in my chest. It was still heavy, but it had direction now. It felt less like something abandoned and more like something carrying a load it was meant to bear. 3 days later, I made a mistake. I told Eleanor about the storage unit. I hadn't planned to, it just slipped out. She had stayed in Richmond after the funeral, the way family sometimes does when they're not ready to go home and sit alone with their grief. We were in Richard's study after dinner, and she was standing in front of his bookshelves with that faraway look people get when they're quietly taking inventory of someone's life. Without thinking, I mentioned that I had found something Richard had left behind. I said he had been working on something important. I didn't tell her what it was. But Eleanor had always been smarter than people gave her credit for. The next morning, she left. She said she was heading back to Los Angeles earlier than expected because something had come up. 4 days after that, a man showed up at my front door. He wore a blue coat and carried a leather portfolio. His hair was gray at the temples and his shoes were expensive and spotless. He introduced himself as Bradley Kern. He said he was a private consultant working with Chesapeake Realty Partners' legal team. Then, with a warm smile and eyes that never wavered, he told me he understood I may have come into possession of documents related to the company, and that Chesapeake Realty wanted to speak with me in a spirit of transparency and resolution. I asked him how he knew anything about any documents. He gave me a smooth, vague answer about industry connections, estate notices, and the way information naturally moves through a business community. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about. Then I thanked him for coming, shut the door, and locked it. After that, I just stood there in the hallway, my heart pounding, staring at the wood grain on the inside of the door. Someone had told them. The only person who knew anything was Eleanor. I called Miles and told him I needed him to come over right away. I asked him to come alone without Piper or the boys. When he got there, I sat him down at the kitchen table and told him everything. I watched his face go from disbelief to something deeper, something heavier. It was the look of a man hearing that what he had always suspected might actually be true. and not yet knowing whether that truth would bring relief or just tear open an old wound. When I finished, he sat there in silence for a long time. "Dad knew," he said at last. It wasn't a question. "Dad knew," I said. He covered his face with his hands. He wasn't crying, not exactly. It was something before tears, something rawer than that. "They already sent someone here," I told him. "So we don't have much time. I've been talking to a journalist in Washington. She's been investigating Chesapeake Realty for almost 3 years. She has the boxes now. But if their lawyers are already showing up at my door, they may try to stop the story before it comes out. We need to be careful." Miles looked up at me. His jaw was set, and I knew that expression. I had seen it on Richard's face more than once when he was working through an engineering problem everyone else said couldn't be solved. "What do we need to do?" he asked. I had been asking myself that ever since the man with the expensive shoes walked off my porch. So I called Tracy Chen. I told her what had happened, and her voice changed immediately. She stopped sounding like a reporter and started sounding like someone moving pieces into place. "I need you to listen carefully," she said. "If Chesapeake Realty's lawyers are already making moves, then they know the documents exist, but they probably don't know exactly what's in them. They'll try to get an injunction to stop publication. The best way to keep that from happening is to move faster than they can. We push the story up. I verified enough to go forward, but I need one more thing, a statement from someone directly harmed by the fraud." "That's Miles," I said. He was sitting across from me at the table, and I had her on speaker. "I'll do it," he said, before I even had the chance to ask. Tracy told us to come to Washington the next morning. She said not to bring anything in the car that they could try to claim was stolen property. She told us not to tell anyone where we were going. She said if we noticed anyone following us, we should call her right away and she would contact the RCMP's commercial crime unit. She added quietly that they had already been briefed on the larger Chesapeake Realty investigation. Miles and I drove up in his car. Neither of us said much along the way. Once we got outside the city, the road stretched out flat and pale, the sky above it the dull gray of old ice. I watched it all pass by and kept thinking about Richard, about all the driving he must have done, all the time and patience it took to gather everything he had. He had done it quietly, carefully, without telling me, without adding to the worry I was already carrying while his health was fading. He had carried it alone, because he loved me, and because that's who he was. I found myself hoping that wherever he was, he somehow knew it was almost finished. Tracy's office was in the Citizen Building on 15th Street. She met us in the lobby, shook Miles's hand, and led us upstairs to a small conference room. Inside, her editor, a serious, compact woman named Caroline, was already waiting with a legal pad. 2 lawyers were on speakerphone. Miles gave his statement. He explained everything, what he had been told the day he was fired, how the documents Chesapeake Realty showed their auditors didn't match anything in his own records, how he had asked for copies and been denied. He talked about the numbered company at the center of it all, how it had been registered just 3 months before he was let go and dissolved 3 months after. He also described how later on a contact at a subcontracting firm told him that one of the key invoices had existed in a completely different form before it appeared in Chesapeake Realty's internal investigation. He spoke for an hour and 35 minutes, his voice never wavered. He sat straight the entire time, calm and clear. Watching him, I couldn't help but think how proud Richard would have been. 3 days later, the story broke. It ran across the front page of the Post and went live on their website at the same time. Tracy had worked with 2 other news outlets to release related stories that same morning. One from a reporter in Richmond, who had been following Dalton's business ties, and another from an NPR correspondent who had been investigating irregularities in municipal grants across several Maryland cities. Tracy's headline read, "How a retired engineer spent 2 years quietly building the case his son's employer hoped would never exist." By noon, Franklin Dalton had released a statement through his lawyers denying everything. By 2 o'clock, 3 members of Chesapeake Realty's board had resigned. By the next morning, the RCMP's commercial crime unit confirmed they had opened an active investigation. The man who had come to my door, Bradley Kern, was later identified in the reporting as a private investigator tied to 3 other corporate fraud cases in Richmond. He wasn't a legitimate legal representative at all. Chesapeake Realty had sent him to figure out what I had, and maybe to intimidate me into backing off. He had misjudged what Richard had built. Eleanor called me a week later. She was already crying before I could say anything. She told me that someone connected to Chesapeake Realty had reached out to her through a mutual acquaintance, someone who had done legal work for their Los Angeles branch. They had asked her to find out what Richard had left behind. She said she thought it was routine, just part of settling the estate. She believed she was helping. By the time she realized what she had actually done, it was too late. I told her I didn't blame her. I told her she hadn't known. And I meant both of those things. "I should have asked you," she said. "I should have just come to you directly." "Yes," I said. "But most of us only learn that lesson after it's already too late." She came back in April for a weekend. We sat together in Richard's study, looking at his bookshelves, not saying much at all. And somehow that felt right. 2 months after the story came out, the RCMP filed charges against Franklin Dalton and 2 senior executives at Chesapeake Realty. A city official was also charged, the same one Tracy had been tracking for over a year, for accepting benefits tied to development grants. Miles's name didn't appear in any of the charges except as a victim. Later, his former employer sent a letter through their lawyers. It acknowledged that the procurement records tied to him had been falsified and confirmed that he had no responsibility for any of the financial misconduct uncovered in the investigation. It was carefully worded, polished. It admitted the truth without offering a real apology. Miles framed it anyway. He hung it in his home office, not as a trophy, but as proof, the same way his father would have. Because Richard had always believed that truth should be something you can hold on to, something solid, something real enough to touch. Spring took its time that year. Richmond has a way of holding on to winter longer than you expect, and that year it dragged on through April and well into May before the ground finally softened. I planted Richard's garden later than he ever would have. Oh, he used to start his seedlings indoors back in February, carefully tending to them under grow lights with a kind of patience I never quite had. I did what I could. By June, the cucumbers were a little scraggly, but they were alive. The hostas he planted along the north fence came back strong on their own. Hostas don't need much guidance, they just grow like they already know exactly what they're doing. Most mornings, I'd walk out there with my tea. I'd stand among the plants Richard had put into the ground, and I'd talk to him. The way you talk to someone who can't answer, but somehow you still feel like they hear you. I told him everything. I told him about the charges being filed. I told him about Miles, how the company he'd been working with had promoted him, how he was starting to laugh again, how that tight look around his eyes was finally beginning to ease. I told him about the boys' spring concert. They both played violin with this intense determination that made half the audience wince and the other half smile. I told him the hostas were doing just fine, and I told him that what he built had held, that the foundation was solid. I also told him I was still a little angry with him for carrying all of that alone, for not trusting me enough to share it while he was still here. And at the same time, I told him I understood why he did it, and that I had forgiven him. Both of those things were true. And maybe that's the most honest way to describe loving someone for 42 years. You can hold more than one truth at the same time. There are things I understand now that I didn't a few years ago. I know now that grief isn't just about loss. It's also about what you inherit. The people we love don't just leave behind empty spaces. They leave their work, their beliefs, the quiet battles they fought when no one was watching. And those things shape us. Sometimes, if we're paying attention, we even get the chance to finish what they started. I've also learned that silence isn't always the same as guilt. Richard stayed quiet because he wanted to protect us. But there comes a point where silence starts to do its own kind of damage. And one of the hardest things in life is knowing when that line has been crossed. I've learned that the systems we trust Legal systems, workplaces, institutions are only as strong as the people inside them. And when that integrity breaks down, it's usually ordinary people who end up paying the price. But it's also ordinary people who step in to fix it. A retired engineer, a journalist, a woman sitting on a cold storage unit floor, reading through boxes of files. There's nothing glamorous about it, just patience, care, and the decision to keep going. I know now that it's never too late to do the right thing. Richard was 66 when he started gathering that evidence. I was 62 when I walked into that storage unit alone, sat down on the concrete, and decided I wasn't going to be afraid of whatever I found in those boxes. We weren't young, we weren't powerful. We didn't have anything special, just time, determination, and a stubborn belief that the truth matters. And I know this more clearly than almost anything else. Loving someone isn't just about the life you share while they're here. It's also about carrying their truth forward after they're gone. It's about being brave enough for both of you when the moment asks for it. Richard used to say that the best bridges are the ones people cross without even noticing. They don't stand out. They don't draw attention. They just do their job, year after year, holding steady no matter what weight comes their way. I think that's what he tried to be for us. And in the end, I think he succeeded. The key to Unit 15 now sits on my kitchen windowsill in a small pottery dish Miles made when he was 10 years old. I see it every morning when I make my tea. I don't need it anymore. The unit is empty. The boxes have done what they were meant to do, but I keep the key because it reminds me that sometimes the most important thing a person leaves behind isn't a will or a house or their name on something permanent. Sometimes it's simply proof that they were paying attention, that they cared enough to act, that they believed the truth was worth protecting, even when it was difficult, even when time was short, even when no one would ever know how much it cost them. But we do know. The people who love them always know, and sometimes that's enough.